What if the killer was already inside the house before the murders even began? What if the family knew someone was living in their attic and chose to say nothing? What if 6 people were slaughtered one by one and nobody in the outside world noticed for nearly a week? What if the most disturbing detail of this entire case is not how they died, but what happened inside that farmhouse in the days after their bodies went cold? And what if the person who did this was never caught, never named, and is still officially unknown to this day? The year is 1922. The place is a small, isolated farming settlement called Hinterkaifeck, located in the Bavarian countryside of Germany, roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. The nearest town is far enough away that you cannot see its lights at night. The nearest neighbor is far enough away that you cannot hear a scream. The farm sits alone in the middle of flat, open land, surrounded by fields that stretch in every direction with nothing to break the view. In winter, when the snow comes down, the farm disappears almost entirely into white silence. It is the kind of place where a person could vanish and the world would not know for days. The Gruber family had lived on this farm for years. Andreas Gruber was the patriarch, a heavy-set, stubborn man in his early 60s who ran the property with a firm hand. His wife, Cazilia, was quiet and kept to herself. Their daughter, Viktoria, lived with them after her husband died in the First World War, and she brought her 2 children with her, a young girl, also named Cazilia, who was 7 years old, and a toddler boy named Josef, who was just 2. The 6th member of the household was their new maid, a woman named Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived at the farm to begin her work. It was her very first day. What most people do not know is that a previous maid had worked at Hinterkaifeck and left in a hurry just months before. When asked why she quit, she said something that should have been taken far more seriously than it was. She said the farmhouse was haunted. She said she heard things in the attic at night, footsteps moving slowly across the floor above her bedroom ceiling. She said it felt like something was living up there, something that moved only after dark. Nobody believed her. She was dismissed as nervous and superstitious. She left and never returned. Then, in the weeks leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber himself began to notice things. A newspaper from a nearby town appeared on the farm, but nobody had ordered it, and nobody had delivered it through normal means. A house key went missing from inside a locked room, and then, one morning, Andreas walked outside and found something in the snow that made him stop completely. There were footprints. They came from the direction of the forest. They led directly to the farmhouse door, and there were no footprints leading back. Whatever made those tracks had walked to the house, and it had not walked away. Andreas told a neighbor what he had seen. Then he went back inside and said nothing more about it. That was the last normal conversation anyone outside that farm ever had with him.
Andreas Gruber was not a man who scared easily. People who knew him described him as tough, practical, and not given to worry. So when he saw those footprints in the snow and chose to go back inside without calling anyone, without reporting anything to the local authorities, it tells you something important. Either he had a theory about who made those tracks and did not want to involve outsiders, or he was more afraid than he ever let anyone see. What happened next suggests it may have been both. In the days that followed, the farm went quiet. Neighbors who lived within reasonable distance noticed that the Gruber family had stopped appearing at church, which was unusual. The mail began to pile up uncollected at the edge of the property. The local newspaper delivery boy noticed that the papers he left were not being picked up day after day, sitting in the same spot untouched. A mechanic who had an appointment with Andreas to repair something on the farm showed up and found nobody at the door. He knocked several times, heard nothing, and eventually left, assuming the family had gone somewhere. None of these people compared notes. None of them raised an alarm. Not yet. It was a group of neighbors who finally decided to go and check on the farm on the morning of March 31st, 1922. They walked across the fields in the cold morning air, called out when they reached the property, and received no answer. The house looked still, the curtains were drawn, but something felt immediately wrong in a way that was hard to explain. One of the neighbors later said it was the silence, not peaceful silence, heavy silence, the kind that pushes back against you. They checked the barn first. What they found inside stopped them completely. All 6 members of the Gruber household were lying dead in the barn. Andreas, his wife Cazilia, their daughter Viktoria, and young Cazilia, the granddaughter, had all been killed there, their bodies stacked and partially covered with hay, as if someone had arranged them. The 2-year-old Josef and the maid Maria were found separately, Josef in his crib inside the house and Maria near the entrance. All 6 had been killed with a mattock, a heavy farm tool used for breaking ground, similar to a pickaxe. The blows were precise, deliberate. This was not the work of someone in a panic. This was controlled, calculated violence, carried out in near total silence so that none of the 6 victims could warn the others in time. The discovery sent immediate shock through the surrounding communities. Police were called and arrived to begin their investigation. But even in those first hours, before the forensic examination had begun, before any suspect had been named, investigators noticed something that made the entire case immediately different from any murder they had encountered before. The animals on the farm were alive and well fed. The cattle had been cared for. Fresh food had been eaten from the kitchen. The fireplace had been used multiple times. And the calendar in the house showed dates that meant the family had been dead for nearly 6 full days before anyone found them. For 6 days, someone had been living on that farm alongside 6 corpses, and whatever they were doing there, they did not want to leave.
6 days. That number kept coming back to investigators as they worked through the evidence in those first hours. The family had almost certainly been killed on the evening of March 31st, 1922, based on the state of the bodies and the last confirmed sightings of family members by outside witnesses. That meant whoever carried out these killings had remained on the Hinterkaifeck farm from that evening until the neighbors arrived, moving through the house, eating the food, tending the animals, and sleeping somewhere on the property, while 6 bodies lay covered in hay just steps away in the barn. The psychological profile of a person capable of that behavior was something the investigators of 1922 Bavaria were completely unprepared to construct. The physical evidence painted a deeply unsettling picture. The kitchen showed signs of recent use. Bread had been eaten. A pot had been used on the stove. The fireplace in the main room held ash from multiple fires, meaning it had been lit on more than one occasion after the murders. The animals, including the cattle and the family's other livestock, had been fed and watered consistently, which required someone to enter the barn where the bodies were kept, step around or over them, carry out the feeding, and then return to the house as if nothing were wrong. Investigators found boot prints in the soft earth near the barn entrance that did not match the footwear of any of the 6 victims. Neighbors who lived within viewing distance of the farm were interviewed, and their statements added another layer of horror to the timeline. At least 2 neighbors independently confirmed that they had seen smoke rising from the Hinterkaifeck chimney on multiple days after the family had already been killed. One neighbor said she assumed the family was simply keeping warm and thought nothing of it. Another said he had considered walking over to check on them, but decided against it because Andreas Gruber was known to be unfriendly toward unannounced visitors. That decision, completely reasonable under any normal circumstance, meant the killer had nearly a week of undisturbed time inside that farmhouse. The forensic examination of the bodies revealed details that investigators initially kept out of public reports. Young Cazilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter, had not died immediately. Evidence suggested she had survived long enough after the initial attack to pull her own hair out in clumps, a response consistent with extreme terror and physical shock. She had been lying in the barn, in the dark,
aware of what had happened around her for some period of time before she died. That detail, when it eventually became known, disturbed even the most experienced investigators assigned to the case. She had been there, in the dark, alone, knowing. The local police quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond their experience and called in investigators from Munich. When the Munich team arrived and began a more systematic examination of the property, they made a discovery that had been overlooked in the initial search. The attic of the farmhouse showed clear signs of recent habitation. There was a makeshift sleeping area, there were food scraps, there were personal items that belonged to nobody in the Gruber family. Someone had been living in that attic, secretly, for an unknown period of time before the murders ever took place. The previous maid had not been imagining things. There had been someone up there all along. And now the investigation had a question it could not answer. How long had they been there? The attic discovery changed everything about how investigators understood the timeline of this case. This was no longer a story about a killer who came from outside, carried out the murders and stayed briefly afterward. This was a story about someone who had chosen the Hinterkaifeck farm specifically, who had planned their presence there carefully enough to live in the attic undetected for what forensic analysis suggested was a period of weeks, possibly longer. The food scraps found up there were in varying states of decay, meaning they had not all been brought at the same time. Someone had been going in and out, bringing supplies, maintaining their hidden space above the family's heads, while the Grubers went about their daily lives completely unaware. Or perhaps not completely unaware. This is the detail that investigators kept returning to. Andreas Gruber had heard the footsteps. He had told a neighbor. He had seen the footprints in the snow leading to the house, with none leading away. He was not an unintelligent man. On some level, he must have understood that whatever he had heard in the attic was not a ghost, not a structural noise, not his imagination. He had chosen not to act on that understanding. Investigators developed two theories about why. The first was that Andreas knew who was up there and was protecting them for reasons that connected to darker secrets within the Gruber family itself. The second was that he was simply too afraid to confront whoever it was directly, and too proud or too stubborn to admit that fear to anyone outside. The investigation that followed was one of the largest ever conducted in Bavaria at that time. Over the course of the months and years after the murders, more than 100 suspects were identified, investigated, and ultimately cleared. The list included farmhands who had previously worked at Hinterkaifeck, distant relatives of the Gruber family, local men with criminal histories, and several individuals who had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. Each investigation led to a dead end. Alibis were confirmed, evidence did not hold, and a case remained open with no arrest, no charge, and no conviction. What investigators did uncover during this period were several uncomfortable truths about the Gruber family itself. Andreas Gruber had a deeply troubled history involving his own daughter, Viktoria, details that were considered scandalous and were suppressed in early public reporting, but that investigators believed may have created enemies within the extended family network. Viktoria's son, Josef, the 2-year-old who was killed in his crib, had no confirmed father in any official record, and rumors surrounding his parentage pointed toward a secret that multiple people in the local community apparently knew about but refused to discuss openly with police. There was also the matter of a letter. Investigators learned through interviews that Andreas Gruber had received at least one written communication in the weeks before the murders that had disturbed him enough to mention it to someone outside the family. The content of that letter was never recovered. The person he mentioned it to remembered only that Andreas had seemed shaken after reading it, which for a man of his temperament was deeply out of character. The letter was never found at the farm. Either Andreas destroyed it or someone else did, and whatever it said,
It may have been the last warning he ever received, before the night everything ended. As the investigation stretched from months into years, and the initial team of investigators was replaced by others, a clearer picture began to emerge of the most credible suspects. None of them could ever be definitively proven guilty, but one name appeared repeatedly across multiple independent lines of inquiry in a way that investigators found impossible to dismiss entirely. That name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was a local farmer who had a direct and complicated personal connection to the Gruber family. He had been in a relationship with Viktoria Gruber and was widely believed by people in the community to be the father of her son, Josef, the toddler killed in his crib. He had reportedly offered to marry Viktoria at one point, an offer that Andreas Gruber had either refused or complicated in ways that created lasting bitterness. Schlittenbauer had also been one of the neighbors who arrived on March 31st to discover the bodies. Witnesses who were present that morning later noted that Schlittenbauer had moved through the crime scene in a way that struck them as unusual. He had gone directly to Josef's body in the house, spent time alone with it, and had handled and moved certain elements of the scene before police arrived. When investigators examined Schlittenbauer's background more closely, they found additional points of interest. He had no confirmed alibi for the evening the murders were believed to have occurred. He was familiar enough with the farm layout to know exactly where each family member would be at a given time of evening, and he had a documented history of conflict with Andreas Gruber that went beyond the question of Viktoria's hand in marriage. Financial disputes over land and livestock had created a level of hostility between the two men that several neighbors described as serious and ongoing. But there was no physical evidence directly connecting Schlittenbauer to the murders. No weapon was ever found, no forensic material from 1922 was sophisticated enough to place him in the attic or the barn with certainty. And Schlittenbauer himself, when questioned, maintained his innocence consistently and without apparent contradiction. He lived in the area for years after the murders, worked his farm, and died in 1941 without ever being charged. The case against him was compelling in circumstance and motive, but empty in proof. Then came the Second World War, and with it, destruction that ended any remaining hope of resolution. The Munich police records from the Hinterkaifeck investigation were largely destroyed during Allied bombing raids on the city. The original case files, witness statements, forensic reports, and investigator notes that had been accumulated over more than a decade of inquiry were gone. What survived were fragments, copies, and second-hand accounts that researchers and historians have worked with ever since to reconstruct the investigation as accurately as possible. The physical farm itself was demolished shortly after the war. The land was cleared. No structure remains. Today, a small memorial marker stands in a field that gives no indication of what happened there, and most people driving past it on the road between Munich and Ingolstadt have no idea what that field once held. More than 100 years have passed since the night someone walked out of the darkness near Hinterkaifeck farm and killed 6 people with a mattock in a barn. A century of forensic advancement, criminal psychology research, investigative methodology, and historical analysis has been applied to this case by researchers, journalists, criminologists, and amateur investigators from around the world. And the official answer remains exactly the same as it was in 1922: unknown. The case is still open. The killer has never been named. No one has ever been held accountable for what happened to Andreas and Cazilia Gruber, to Viktoria, to young Cazilia, to little Josef in his crib, and to Maria Baumgartner on her very first day of work. The theories that have emerged over the decades each carry a degree of credibility and a degree of uncertainty. The case against Lorenz Schlittenbauer remains the most circumstantially complete. His connection to Viktoria, his disputed paternity of Josef, his documented conflict with Andreas, his strange behavior at the crime scene, and his lack of alibi form a picture that many serious investigators have found persuasive. But persuasive is not the same as proven, and without the destroyed files and without a confession, persuasive is all it will ever be. Other theories have pointed toward a drifter or vagrant who happened upon the isolated farm and saw an opportunity. The attic habitation supports the idea of someone without a permanent home, someone who had been moving through the countryside and found the Hinterkaifeck farm a convenient and undetected shelter. The newspapers that appeared on the property from a town nobody in the family had visited could support this theory, brought by someone traveling through from that direction. But a random drifter theory struggles to explain the controlled nature of the killings, the precise and unhurried way each victim was managed, and the calm domestic behavior that followed in the days after. A third theory, less discussed but not without foundation, points inward toward the Gruber family itself and the web of secrets that investigators uncovered within it. The suppressed details of Andreas Gruber's personal conduct, the unclear parentage of young Josef, the financial disputes, and the suggestion that Andreas knew more about the attic presence than he admitted, all raise the possibility that the motive for these murders was rooted in something private and deeply personal that the outside world was never fully allowed to see. What we know for certain is this: 6 people lived on an isolated farm in Bavaria in the winter of 1922. Someone chose them. Someone planned their approach carefully enough to live above them in silence for weeks. Someone killed them all in a single evening with enough control to prevent any alarm being raised. And then that same someone stayed, cooked food, lit fires, fed animals, and existed in that farmhouse for nearly a week before quietly disappearing back into a world that never identified them. The Hinterkaifeck farm is gone. The files are gone. The witnesses are gone. And the killer, whoever they were, died without ever answering for what they did. So here is the question we want to leave with you tonight. If the person who did this lived among other people for the rest of their life, went to markets and churches and passed people on roads, if they grew old and died in a bed somewhere while young Cazilia's family was still buried in Bavarian soil, what does it mean that we never found them? And what does it say about the world they lived in, and perhaps the world we still live in, that someone can do something like this and simply walk away? Tell us what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. Share your theory in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, it means you understand why we do what we do here at Lost Beyond Sight. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay close, because the next case we are bringing you is one that investigators themselves have described as the most psychologically disturbing file they ever opened.